Hey, everybody, welcome back to Odd and Untold. This is episode 16. I'm joined again by my buddy Josh Diaz. He was on episode 4. We talked about some weird encounter we had in the Adirondacks, but tonight we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about exorcisms. And this sort of came up just, I guess, because we're coming up on the Halloween season. And the other night, Josh and I were just talking, and dude, I forget even how it came up, but you just sort of asked me about The Exorcist, and my son and I just decided to put it on again last night. I mean, I've seen it, a dozen times already in my life, but we put it on again last night. And I definitely just wanted to talk to you and get your thoughts on just exorcisms and demonic possessions. It's something that a lot of ghost hunting groups talk about, demons, everything's a demon, or this is demonic. And, it's a weird overlap between like the paranormal and religion. And you and I have discussed this over many a campfire over the past couple of years.
Right. Yeah.
Just wanted to get into that with you. So, The Exorcist, you've seen the movie, I'm sure.
Yep. Yeah. It's been a long time. I remember, I think I've only seen it twice. The first time I watched it, I think I was maybe like 20. I was at a college frat party at a frat house. And while the party's raging on the first floor, it's maybe like 2 a.m. I went up to the second floor. It was a Halloween party. And I went up to the living room. There was nobody up there. And I sat down and The Exorcist had just started. So I literally watched The Exorcist on Halloween by myself, at a frat party was raging below me. And and I think I watched it like once, maybe 5 years later. But yeah, to this day, in my opinion, it's probably the scariest movie I've ever seen. There's a lot of scary movies out there, but for me, there's reasons why that's the scariest for me. And so I think the interesting thing, we've talked about this a little bit, but it was kind of ahead of its time. It was, I don't know when it was officially released. I want to say probably the late to mid 70s.
It was 73, I believe.
Okay, so it was early 70s.
Yeah.
It was at a time where there was still quite a lot of there was still quite a bit of religious people out there. A lot of people that were superstitious. There was a lot of, not that religious people are overly superstitious, but there was still a lot of belief of, demons and, that kind of thing. And the interesting thing was that it's one of those old movies where it's kind of like a slow burn. It's got a build up. There's not a lot of music throughout it. If you watch, like, for example, Insidious, it starts off with that, like, that offbeat, scratchy violin music and, this blaring music, and it kind of sets you up for the movie. And the sounds of Insidious and all those, movies of that nature are kind of set to kind of make you uncomfortable. It's not harmonious, so already you're kind of teeth set on edge. You have, special effects, lots of special effects in the newer movies, lots of, music and drama, and you can almost anticipate when a scary scene is going to come up, or a jump scare. But with The Exorcist, I haven't seen it in a long time, so it's fresh in your head. But yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. So with The Exorcist, it was just like this slow burn build up. There wasn't a lot of music. The scares were real. So if you got scared, it wasn't from this, like, offbeat scratchy tune or this huge thumping sound that happened. It was just straight scares. And I think that kind of set it apart, and the fact that, like, it really set the bar for movies of that genre. Set it real high. So
yeah and it is fresh in my mind, and I was watching it last night, and I did notice a lot of the things you're talking about, that it is a slow burn. It's one of these things where when you first start watching, like, if you've never seen this movie before and you know nothing about it, if you're going into it, you don't quite know where you're going at first. It's like, where it kind of starts off in Iraq, and it's this old guy and he's digging up relics, and then it kind of moves to Georgetown, and it's a woman filming a movie, and it's just, where are they going with this? The music is very minimalistic. I mean, there is music and there's creepy music, but it's not like today's movies where there's like you said, like jump scares, or there's music to sort of let you know you need to be scared right now. So here's gonna be some loud music.
Right.
And
Right.
are you scared because of what's actually happening on screen? Or are you scared because the music sort of jump starts you,
Right.
And yeah, at the time, there were, horror movies weren't really a big deal at the time. I mean, there were horror movies out there, but they weren't really mainstream. They were more sort of like indie, sort of cult classic type things that people would go see. But with The Exorcist, you had people waiting in line, 4 hours, around the block waiting to get into this movie. It just generated so much buzz.
Right.
So in a way, it was almost like Star Wars, where like sci-fi was just not a big genre. The summer blockbuster was not a genre, and Star Wars sort of changed that, and The Exorcist sort of changed that for horror movies. And it's scary in its realism,
right?
Because it really doesn't pull any punches. There's gore in the sense that there's not a lot of blood, but there's vomit. I mean, there's the infamous,
pea soup
puking on the priest. There's, she's spitting phlegm at him. She's got like kind of open cuts on her face. I think the real visceral thing with this movie is Linda Blair. She's this 12-year-old girl playing, Reagan, and she's just this cute cherubic child, and she transforms into a demon, and the things that she says and does. I mean, she's, and again, turn back now, anybody listening, if you're easily offended, but she, is masturbating with a crucifix. She's telling the priests to sodomize her, essentially. And this is a 12-year-old girl, and it's practical effects. Like you said earlier, there's no CGI. It's all, makeup. And when the bed is shaking, it's an actual bed that's being shaken. And when she's being flipped around, the actress is really being flipped around. It's just a very visceral sort of movie that we don't get anymore. Nowadays, it's the Marvel movies and the Star Wars, and it's 99% CGI, and what's actually there? Nothing. In this movie, it's just, she throws up in this guy's face, and it's like you kind of want to puke yourself. And I think that's really what got audiences worked up at the time, because back in the 70s, you had, a lot of Westerns, you had a lot of the gangster movies, you had, and people would get shot and they kind of hold their stomach and they fall over. There's not a lot of blood and gore, you might see some caps, but nothing really excessive. And this was just, and it's an intense movie. Just with the actual exorcism itself is an intense scene with the two priests trying to exorcise the demon. And it's just, I think it, like you said, it really set a new bar for horror movies.
For sure. Yeah. And that, what's interesting to me was I was watching, and I think this is what brought up the discussion. We were having a discussion, I think, in our camping group.
Yes.
You and I, we have our little Facebook Messenger group with a couple of the guys, Dan and Dustin and Pete, and you and myself. And somehow I just brought up The Exorcist because I had just watched like the history of The Exorcist.
Okay.
And what was interesting was seeing, like, they had interviews, like camera crews that kind of went into the movie theaters and were filming people as they're going in. And you're right, there was like these massively long lines. And, there was this, they interviewed people that were, running out of the movie theater screaming. Some people fainted in the movie theater. Some people actually threw up in the movie theater. There was a lot of people that were just very, very disturbed about this movie. And so, it's to this day, you really don't hear of movies having that kind of effect on people. And I don't know exactly, maybe it was just the time, maybe it was just the perfect time to have that kind of a movie, because a lot of people just weren't ready for it.
Right.
And I think, they went in there, they knew it was scary. I'm not sure, it would be interesting to see what the preview was. And I don't know, have you seen the preview, like an old reel of the preview? I haven't, but
no,
I don't think
it
go ahead.
I should have looked at one, but I didn't. But I guess you're right. I don't think it showed too much. And again, like,
I don't think so. Yeah.
There's no internet back then. I mean, now, like, a movie comes out and within seconds of the movie being out, you go online and Wikipedia has the entire synopsis, spoilers, the cast. It has got, there's no surprises anymore. There's no, you hear about a movie and you're going to know everything about it before you go in. It's kind of sad in a way because you
Yeah,
don't get that surprise anymore. But yeah, you're right. I
right.
think it was just people didn't know what to expect.
Yeah, yeah, and it was they would interview them, and they would kind of not really have good explanations. Like, um, one girl just kind of fumbled trying to figure out why she fainted, and one girl threw up, and one was saying why she ran out of the theater. She said, I waited for 4 hours to get in this movie, and I got to, I believe it was the pea soup scene or something like that. It was one of those scenes, and just ran out, and you know they didn't like what seemed to be a consistent theme for the people that didn't like that was the demonic voice. And I think
Yeah.
that was new for screen. People weren't used to seeing a little girl, and I don't know if that was her voice or if it was some kind of voiceover or something like that, but that was probably one of the most creepy and eerie parts of the movie, along with just her flipping all over, the head spinning and all that. But the voice, it's the demonic voice, that was creepy for a lot of people, and it really unsettled people that were watching it.
And it still is, because I was watching that last night, and I believe it was another actress who did the voice. Because I was watching a documentary about it after, and they were saying that they had another actress, and she actually required them to strap her into a chair while she recorded her lines. I guess she wanted to kind of feel like the child, like being restrained. But it was an older woman because, yeah, and I guess Linda Blair, the actress who played Reagan, just mouthed the lines, or maybe she said them and they just overdubbed this
Right.
older woman's voice. But there's so much layering of the voices because there's the main voice, and then there's always like these undercurrents of other voices underneath, like played backwards or different languages. There's some Latin thrown in there. There's some French. I know there's some backwards English, but it's just, I mean, even listening to it last night, it's like you don't really get this type of scare anymore. Modern movies, they go for the cheap thrills, the cheap scares,
Right.
there's not that like psychological torture anymore of just scaring you with subtlety, and just this
Right.
voice that is not, it's not even otherworldly. It's just an older woman's voice, and you listen to it and it's just gravelly. It sounds like somebody who smokes,
Right.
but they mix in these other voices kind of underneath, and like the
Right.
growling and the breathing and the wheezing, and it's like those little touches. You're like, there's more than one person in there. That's not just one
Right.
person talking, and it's that's what makes you feel like, oh, this is demonic. There's something otherworldly in this little girl, and it's not just her putting on a voice, or I'm super scary, because that's fine, it sounds a little scary, but it's those subtleties, it's just the sound,
Yeah.
the auditory stuff that gets you as well.
Right. Yeah. And what's interesting is that the producer of the movie, he was interviewed in this one documentary I'm watching, and he was talking about that he had heard these stories about exorcisms and stuff like that, and I can't remember all the details of this, but he essentially said that what he wanted to show the world was the reality of the spiritual world, and
Right.
that's what he really wanted to bring out in the picture, and that he wanted to just he just wanted to convey. It was actually almost like in a sense, and I'm going to use this word loosely, almost like an evangelistic attempt to convince the world that demons and the supernatural exists.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think most of the world, a lot of the world at the time was, pretty much believe that anyway. But I think it was maybe, I think this was just more of an in your way face to do it. And up until that time, you hadn't seen any movies of this kind. There was nothing
Right.
that addressed the subject. It was probably a taboo subject, honestly. If you brought that up, people, your Catholic grandmother would be like, don't say that at the kitchen table. You probably wouldn't have much discussion about it. I don't know. Maybe at your house you probably did. I know you guys are into paranormal early on, so you might have had the discussion. I know at my house, my mom really didn't like talking about that kind of thing. She still's not very. She didn't like. Yeah, she didn't like discussing it. My wife doesn't like discussing it either.
I think it's
just scared by
uncomfortable.
it, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are fine talking about ghosts. They're fine talking about weird stuff happening, and oh, I put my keys somewhere, and the next day they were somewhere else. And there's a somewhat of a comfort in that it's kind of like a kooky campfire story, and you can kind of tell people, and it's it's a little weird, it's a little scary, but it doesn't really touch on faith or anything deeper than that. It's like something moved my keys, or I heard footsteps upstairs, like there's something in that it's there, but it's very far away, and you talk about exorcism, you talk about demonic possession, that insinuates, if it's real, it insinuates so much, there's such an implication there that, okay, if there's demonic possession, if there are demons, then is there actually a God, which again is a question for a lot of people,
for sure.
And if that is possible and there's just this pure evil, then maybe there is a heaven, maybe there is a hell, are we really going there? Are our spirit, and that's very different than, the knock on the door that shouldn't be there, or the footsteps, or the missing keys.
That's safe.
It's safe, right? And I think a movie like this, it's not just that it scares you viscerally. I mean, it scares you psychologically, because now you're not just saying, oh, I heard some footsteps, and maybe it was mice in the walls, but maybe it was just grandma coming to say hi.
Right.
This movie's like, maybe the devil's coming to say hi.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a whole different story, and they even mentioned in the movie, like, Father Karras, he's talking to Reagan, and he says, let's introduce ourselves, like, who are you? And she just says, I'm the devil, and he mentions this later on to her mother. He's like, look, she doesn't even say I'm a demon. She says she's the devil, like the devil. And he kind of makes a joke, and he was like, this is kind of akin to a mental patient saying I'm Napoleon. It's not this delusion of like, oh, I was a Native American in such and such tribe, and I was the hunter gatherer, and I was basically a nobody. I was Napoleon, or I was the King of England, or I was, these delusions of grandeur. So he was very skeptical, because he was saying, she's the devil. And, whether that's the case or not in an exorcism or in a demonic possession, if these things are real, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but that is very different than just hearing some footsteps upstairs. That has far-reaching implications. If you're gonna believe it.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to not only just a spiritual realm. It takes into account, that there's a moral realm, this moral realm that's here, but also in that spiritual realm as well. That we, that just a greater reality than what we're used to, and the fact that these types of entities would attack us, injure us, kill us. That's seeing a ghost, seeing your keys kind of disappear. Seeing something mild like that, maybe it's frightening because you're just, it's just that reaction of seeing something paranormal. You just have that knee-jerk reaction of, but knowing something like waking up in the middle of the night and you're speaking in some kind of demonic voice, and you can't control it, and you're frozen to the bed, and you're flopping around, and things are, cuts are coming on your body, and that kind of thing, like, that's scary. That, if that's true, they're after you, right? They're after you specifically. So that adds an element of fear, because that's a spiritual entity that's evil, that's acting out its will against you, being inside you and trying to harm you and injure you, not just physically, but trying to get your soul in the end. So it's a scary thought if one accepts that, right. So
Yeah, because it's not just about getting your attention. It's not just about, oh, this is just something passing through, or this is a residual haunting. And every April 25th at 3 a.m., we hear these footsteps, and it's harmless. It's spooky because you don't understand it, but demonic possession, if you accept such a thing, is a very targeted thing, and it's not just to say, hey, I'm here. It's basically saying I'm taking you.
Yeah,
I'm going to
right.
control your body. I'm going to possess you. I want your soul.
Yeah,
And it's the complete loss of individuality. It's the complete loss of yourself.
right.
So it's
Yeah,
very different than just hearing footsteps or the weird little thing out of the corner of your eye that you see.
right.
So yeah, far-reaching implications.
And what's interesting about these types of things, because you look at movies like, let's say, I'll leave Insidious out of this one, but The Conjuring, 1 and 2. I don't know about the third one. I don't know if that was based on any kind of historical event, but the Conjuring. I actually, yeah, there may have been something in the third one. I don't know if they mentioned the Amityville haunting, but either way, I 1 and 2 for sure, speak of supposed true events that happened within the last 50, 60 years. And that's what makes some of these scary, is that when you see a movie that's based on a true story or loosely based on a true story, it's kind of a scary thing, because someone testified to this.
Right.
Someone or a group of people testified to this and were willing to allow their story to be told. Obviously Hollywood dramatizes it, and the story has changed, but the essence of the story is still there. And what do we do with that? It's definitely something to it's definitely something that you're like, wow, okay, this could potentially be true, unless these guys are all lying. That's a possibility too.
Right. And the other possibility, and I wanted to talk to you about this, and we talked about this off air a little bit, was a lot of these exorcisms happened. I think the one that The Exorcist was based on was based off this child, Rob Doe. And it was in 1948, and he was given an exorcism, and a lot of that story turned out to be not so true. There were a lot of facts that, when they were looked into, it was like, well, he didn't actually live here. This didn't actually happen. So there's a lot of hearsay. The other side of that was mental illness wasn't really understood at that time.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff in our past that we're saying, you're possessed by the devil, or you're a werewolf. A lot of people think werewolf legends and vampire legends sprung up to explain serial killers, because people would kind of have a fugue state, or they'd go out and they'd wake up in the morning covered in blood, and what happened? Only an animal could do this. No, you turned into a werewolf, or you're a vampire. So a lot of these old European legends sort of sprang up, they believe, to account for things that now we understand as mental illness. So that being said, with exorcisms, there's some oddities to them that don't, mental illness seems like a nice, comfortable explanation to say this child or this person is having an episode. They're mentally ill. They think they're possessed by the devil. And I'm not saying that all exorcisms or all people who are possessed are mentally ill, but I think a great number of them are, probably. There's,
Right.
especially as word gets out about what does this look like to be mentally, to be possessed. Okay, I'm going to curse, and I'm going to scream, and I'm going to talk in another language.
Right.
But you have these instances where someone who is possessed is speaking in a tongue that they should not know. Someone is speaking French or Latin. Latin is basically a dead language, and it's not really spoken anywhere unless you're taking a college course in it and you're a,
Right.
a Latin scholar. How are you going to know Latin?
Right.
And I know, and again, I don't know offhand. I've heard of cases of exorcisms where people were supposedly speaking ancient tongues, Mesopotamian, or things like that. and those are the cases that kind of interest me more. And again, how is a mental illness fixed just by guys throwing holy water on you and chanting? I could understand the mental illness causing that. I can't understand an exorcism curing that, because if there's something that wrong with your brain, I don't think that's psychosomatic, that you just believe that, okay, if these people come in and exorcise me, I'll be fine again. And it never happens again. They lead a productive life ever after. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'll bring up two perspectives. I'll try to speak to some of the Catholic perspective, and I'm going to speak on that loosely because I'm not an expert in the Catholic view of exorcism, but I have watched some documentaries and some YouTube type documentaries, as a man of faith, coming at it from that perspective and saying, wow, okay, I see where he's coming from there. I'll also give a personal perspective, and I've mentioned to you before that years ago, and this would be more from a Protestant perspective. It's slightly going to be different from Catholic, but more of a Protestant, Pentecostal, charismatic type tradition of faith perspective of exorcisms. So I'll get into that in a second. But I think that with the Catholic view, there are obviously, this is a religious thing. So when exorcisms in general, most that you hear are from a religious perspective. I'm not sure what the Muslim perspective is. Like there's jinns and stuff like that, which are demons in Islam. I don't know how they handle that. I'm not 100% sure how like people in Judaism handle that. But I'll give a Christian perspective. A Protestant perspective versus a more of a Catholic perspective. I think with the Catholic tradition, you're going to see a lot of things like tradition. So it's not necessarily something that you'll pick up a Bible and you'll be like, where do I find holy water? You're not going to find it. It's not there. I've read the Bible cover to cover multiple times. You're not going to find holy water mentioned there, at least not in the context that the Catholic priests are describing it.
Right.
So to answer that, I don't know what power holy water actually has, but according to the Catholic, there is power in it. I think also that what you're seeing in and you'll see this in a lot of the newer movies and stuff like that, they're kind of putting a little bit of science to some of the exorcisms. Like if you watch, I think it's maybe the Exorcism of Emily Rose. There's a couple other ones that are in the last 10, 15 years that where the priests kind of take a more methodical approach to it. They're like kind of examining the person to see if it's more of a mental health type issue, and then just kind of figuring it out. I think they go through those processes, and then at the end, people are at their end of the rope, and they're like, a priest is what we need, because we've tried the scientific approach and it's not explaining things. And so so the Catholics will come in and they'll have these rituals, they'll have the holy water, they'll sprinkle it on, and it's supposed to burn or whatever it's supposed to do. And they'll have this book on rites. And a lot of them are just either scriptures that they're reading, or it'll be some kind of, rite that has the ideas of scripture, like the power of Christ compels you. That's not necessarily in the Bible. You don't see anybody in the Bible saying those words, but you will find in the Bible the general idea that, yeah, the power of Christ compels you to obey. So that is something that you'll find in the scriptures. From the perspective that I hold, and I'll actually, let me get into that a little bit. So years ago, I was trained in my old church in what we call deliverance. So we don't call it exorcism. We call it deliverance, like delivering someone, like setting them free.
Right. So
there's the idea of that. And what we had been trained at our church, it was a group that had been trained and as deliverance ministers. And what we would do was we would be trained on what's called the Pablo Batari method. And Pablo Batari was this this Christian guy out of Brazil, and or no, I'm sorry, Argentina. And years ago, I don't know, maybe it was like 25 years ago, there was a revival in Argentina, led by this guy named Carlos Anacondia. And basically, it was this guy who was like an evangelist, and he would go out and, God calls him to go out and preach the gospel to these different cities. I think it was Buenos Aires and a few other places. But when he would go to these places, what would happen was he'd start preaching, and then every now and then you'd see people in the crowd just start screaming and manifesting demons, like, just freaking out. And he had to learn through that time on, on deliverance. What does the Bible say? How do we do that? We're not Catholics. We don't have this Catholic tradition. We don't have these Catholic rites. We don't have our little Bible. We don't have the beads. We don't have the holy water. But what does the Bible say? And so he learned during that time that the idea that in the Bible, it talks about, and you've heard this before, that God has a kingdom. So the way a kingdom works is there's a king and there's everybody else underneath him. And it works under this idea of authority. So this king can delegate authority to whoever he wishes. So when a person operates under what's called kingdom authority, the authority given to you by God, you have this authority to be able to cast out demons and evil spirits. And so I believe, and this is part of that Pablo Batari method, that all Christians have that ability that's given to them as part of, it's in the scriptures. You can find it. It's in the Gospels. Jesus says, I give you the authority to cast out demons, heal the sick, that kind of thing. So there is this authority that's given to us from the boss. And so when we get, and historically in the scriptures, what you'll find when demons are mentioned in the Bible, it's almost always when Jesus is preaching. So he's preaching the kingdom of God, he's preaching the gospel, he's talking about that, and somebody starts manifesting in the crowd, or he walks up to somebody, or somebody runs to him, and like the story of Legion, he just happened to go to this one place. It was the guy who was demon possessed by over 1,000 demons, and he used to cut himself, with sharp rocks, and no chains could hold him. He had supernatural power. He could break chains. And they would find him among the graves and the tombs. So he would hang out there, this demon-possessed guy. Jesus comes into the area, and the guy runs at Jesus and throws himself at his feet, and says, Jesus, Son of God, why have you come to torment us? And Jesus says to him, what's your name? And he says, my name is Legion, for we are many. And a Roman legion was 1,000 soldiers. So that was what it's loosely based off of. I don't know if it was exactly 1,000 demons, but that's the idea. Was there was a Roman legion would have been understood as 1,000. So this guy had at least 1,000 demons in him. Jesus casts out the demon, or the demon actually doesn't want to be sent to this place of torments, doesn't want to be sent to hell. Asks Jesus to cast him out into the swine. It was like a nearby flock of pigs. And so Jesus casts the demon out. It all those demons, like 1,000 or more, fly into this herd of pigs, and they all like run off this cliff and kill themselves, in the ocean below, the rocks below. That's an example of kingdom authority happening. And then Jesus gives the authority to the disciples. The disciples, they go out and they start doing the same thing, and they come back and tell Jesus, oh my gosh, we go out and we use the authority and demons are submitting to us. So it was a matter of, you don't see anywhere in that, prayer beads or holy water. It was simply a matter of speaking authoritatively, like you would to your son,
right?
Or you would to your kids, or you would to your dog. You speak from a place of authority, and it doesn't have to necessarily, there's nowhere in the Bible that says you got to scream or yell at the top of your lungs. I mean, you could essentially sign language your authority, but it's that recognition of authority. And that's something that's fundamental to this, to the deliverance method that I was taught. Okay. And so basically what it gets down into is, people open themselves up to all kinds of things, through occult practices, through, simple lifestyles and stuff like that. And I'm not saying everybody, but there's particular people where they kind of open themselves up and they've opened these doors. And through that, demons have been able to come into their lives. And what often happens, sometimes it happens at church, sometimes it happens in weird places out in public, but, someone will start manifesting a demon. And so you would ask the question, how do you determine whether it's a demon, whether it's somebody just acting out, whether it's a mental illness? And that's a tough thing. I mean, on the spot, if it were to happen at church, or if we were out in some kind of crusade out in the neighborhood, I don't necessarily know. But you would talk. The way we were trained was to talk with that person. We would take authority of their spirit. We'd command the spirit to stop speaking, and we would talk to the person.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would go through what's called liberation. We'd ask them, what did you involve yourself? What did you involve yourself in for this demon to come in? What are you involved in? You're involved in cultic practices. You're involved in, a lot of people are, hedonism, that kind of thing. There's a lot of different things that can open the door for that. And so we would find those areas, and then what we would do is we would lead that person to renouncing that sin, which is basically repenting of it, turning away from it, and then they would renounce it, and then they would take their authority back. So what happened was, it was this kind of like this, they gave their authority to this demon, and the demon now has authority over them. So they take their authority back, and then we pray for them, and we lead that person in that. And generally what happens is, from that process, the person will accept Christ. The person will say, I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to have these demons having authority over my life. I want to walk in my own authority, the authority God has given me. And so they walk in freedom. And so that's it's called a liberation process. And there's more steps to it, but I don't want to dominate the conversation for the next 20 minutes.
No,
but that's
kind
of the idea. That's kind of the idea. And one of the big things too is that if that were to happen in church, and I've actually seen this happen in church, I've seen, I can get into that if you want me to, but I've seen where a guy came up and started manifesting what looked like demons.
Wow.
It was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. At first, me and my friend were kind of chuckling, like, what's this guy doing? But we weren't chuckling after a while, when we realized what we believed to have been demonic, manifestation. But we don't let the demons take over the show. And I think that's something that you see a lot in the Catholic rites. And this is just my opinion. I think they give the demon too much airtime. And you just don't see that in scripture. And I'm sure I'm going to get a Catholic probably responding to me in the comments later, but and that's fine. But you just don't see it in scripture. You don't see that, you don't see this long drawn out conversation, vulgar display of power, and and talking all these things for days on end, and listening to them, and and having a conversation. You don't, and that's you just don't see that in scripture. The only thing you'll see is Jesus asking for the name of that particular demon.
Right.
That's the only time you'll ever see in scripture, really, where they have any kind of like real dialogue. The idea is just don't dialogue with them. Don't let them steal the show away from God. I mean, and that's what they would love to do. Is just take people away from God, and that's the not just with a show, but in a person's life.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny you mentioned that, because again, in the movie, just to go back to that for a second, and I know that the author, William Peter Blatty, he spoke to a lot of priests while he was writing his book, and when they were making the movie, they did a lot of research. And even in the movie, Father Merrin, who's the older priest, the more he's the exorcist, he tells Father Karras, don't talk to this being, don't let this being take over the conversation, don't listen to it. Like, we're not going in there to have a conversation, we're going in there to perform these rites and to exorcise this child. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I believe that The Exorcist was based on a more Catholic way of doing things. Because I don't know about the other denominations, Protestant, or if they even still do exorcisms. I know the Catholic Church will barely do them. I mean, it's not something. And again, they mentioned that in the movie, like in 1973, they're like, it just doesn't happen anymore, And Father Karras in the movie is a psychologist, and so I thought that was an interesting way of doing it because he's a priest, so he's a man of faith, but he's also a trained psychologist.
Right.
So he's approaching this. Initially, he approaches it from a psychological standpoint. He's a man of faith, but he's also saying, we know so much more about mental illness now. And at one point, he tells her this is holy water, and he throws it on Reagan, and she thrashes about and she's screaming. And then he goes down and tells the mother, and he says, no, this is just tap water. And she reacted, and that doesn't really help my case going to the church to say I need an exorcism, because she's not exhibiting much proof. And again, like, he recorded her speaking, and it was all backwards English,
Right.
So all his proof was kind of like not really proof. But then there were other scenes in the movie, and I want to get into that with like real exorcisms, because I do think there's a lot that you can pick apart in an exorcism and say, this is mental illness, this is that, this is this, this is, go to the DSM-4 and find the diagnostic manual and find the, here's the symptoms, here's the diagnosis, here's what she has. But I do think there are instances where there's things that are documented where the possessed will speak, like I said, a forgotten language or a dead language or language they shouldn't know.
Right.
If they have a housekeeper who speaks Portuguese, you're going to pick up Portuguese. If your grandmother speaks Italian, you may pick up Italian. Even subconsciously, you're going to pick up enough maybe to speak it in a state like that. You get hypnotized, you can remember all sorts of things. So that's always interesting to me, when someone who has no exposure to that particular language is now speaking that language, Aramaic or Mesopotamian or something like that, or Latin. That's interesting if there's documentation of that, where that this person is now who's never had exposure to that. So I'm me, I'm more of a skeptic. I mean, you're more on the spiritual side. I'm kind of, I'm the psych major. I majored in psychology. I got my degree in psychology. I know about mental illness. I took a lot of abnormal psych courses, which is probably not a politically correct term anymore, but 30 years ago when I was in college, it was. But of just mental illness and what these diseases look like, what paranoia looks like, what schizophrenia looks like, what borderline personality looks like. And I think these days people would hear about an exorcism and just immediately say it's mental illness.
Yeah. And, I think it's such a good point, because obviously we don't want to go through from a church perspective, we don't want to go through that thing. If that's all, if it's a mental illness, get them help, medication, whatever it is that they need, and there is a process. Like I said, you sit down and you talk with the person, and within that conversation, there may be some things that are spiritual there, but you may actually find when you're interviewing the person, that there is some mental health issues there. When I look at the diagnostic statistical manual for mental illness, I think to myself, it describes certain things, but I don't know if it makes a certain like a complete truth claim on them. For example, if someone is, let me put it in this perspective. I always wondered to myself, if I were to, I would think to myself, there may be a lot of people in a mental health institution that are actually having a demonic experience. However, they're diagnosed as being, schizophrenic, but they're literally being oppressed by demons and are not getting the help that they should be getting, because what's happening is they're just being medicated, or they're just, a danger to themselves and others. So they're put in a, lunatic asylum. But meanwhile, they're literally having these experiences. So I leave room for that too. That even though that there's diagnoses and statistical analysis of what could be and what probably most likely is a mental illness, but I also think that there's that doesn't tell us, the statistical manual doesn't tell us these truths, these ideas that are outside of science per se. It's not going to tell us, the existence of morality. It's not going to tell us whether an argument for God or the existence of the devil is a good one, or if it should be entertained. So it's just going to give us kind of a guide for how we can look at something and say it's probably a mental, it's to our best understanding of science at this point, it is a mental illness. If someone were to be, it completely broaches the topic, and it would look at it as pseudoscience or something like that, like exorcisms and deliverance, that type of thing. If the presupposition of the statistical manual is that those things that exist, of course it's going to push away everything else. It's not going to, if the position going into diagnosing the problem is not an open-minded thing, you have psychologists that will take the scientific approach and say, okay, I'm going to use this manual. This is what I'm going to use. I may potentially add to it. There may be research that could add or change that gets amended. I wouldn't say quite frequently, but it does get amended every few years or every 10 years. The statistical manual.
Right.
So it does change. It's a static thing. It's not a static thing. It does change. It does evolve as new things come in. But that doesn't necessarily mean everything's a demon either. But just as it is, it's not everything is always a mental illness. At least not in my view. I think that that we should approach it from a sense from the idea of these two things could potentially be what the issue is. Of course, if you're a psychologist, you're going to lose your job if you bring in some kind of faith perspective, and that's fine. And that's why you're not going to hear any psychologists embracing those ideas, at least not publicly or in the workplace. Maybe privately at home, but they're not going to embrace that anywhere where it can threaten their livelihood. But for a person of faith that can accept those things, I see the difference between, say, someone of faith or a Catholic exorcist or a deliverance minister is that we can look at the statistical manual and say, yeah, that could be it, and that could be helpful to us, is for sure. But we also have the other eye open, saying, we do believe these other things exist, and so we don't just throw those out either. So kind of, in my view, it gives it a more broad view. I don't think science can explain all the things in the universe. Science can't explain math, but we're rational to believe math. Science has to assume math exists in order to even work. Especially in physics and things like that, you have to assume the existence of math. And we can't explain it through science, but it's a thing that exists, but it can't be explained through science. Aesthetic judgments like beauty, we can all say we've experienced beauty in our lives, but we can't scientifically quantify that or say that this is something that's explained by science. So there are things in that we're rational to believe in this world that science can't explain. And I think for us who are ascribed to like the paranormal, that's something that we're open to. I know you are. You're a skeptic, but I think I think you truly believe in your heart that you probably say something along, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I come more skeptical, but but at the back of my mind, I'm open. I truly do believe that there is something more to this universe than just science can explain, and there's some really spooky, weird things out there. And I think that the people of faith and the people who embrace the paranormal, we kind of we're okay with that. It doesn't always have to fit into a cookie cutter scientific methodology. Although we want to embrace that as well, but we don't want to completely shut that out. But we don't want to shut out the spiritual side either, because many of us have accepted the fact that there's a spiritual realm, and that's what exorcisms are.
And that's the danger in taking one side or the other. And I think you and I have kind of had this discussion before, possibly even on the podcast. I can't remember anymore, but just when you become so dogmatic in your I'm scientific, and just what we know now is what exists, you miss stuff, because you're looking at the world a certain way, and you're trying to fit it, like you said, you're trying to fit it into this box of science. It has to fit into this, and anything we don't understand, it's just, well, no, it goes in the box, and it's got to be explained by science. And you're right about me that I do take a more skeptical approach, but I've seen things I can't explain. I've experienced things I can't explain. And again, I can tell someone else and they're going to say, no, it was this, or no, it was that, or, and I'm the only one who can say objectively, No, I was alone. You may think someone broke into the house and knocked on my door, or you think that the house was settling, or you think X, Y, or Z. I was there and I know. And,
Right.
that's kind of where, human hubris kind of comes into this of just, okay, anybody who's experiencing these symptoms, you're mentally ill. And it goes beyond that because it's like, oh, you saw a UFO, you're mentally ill, or you must have been on drugs, or you must be a backwoods hillbilly. Oh, you had an encounter with the paranormal. Oh, you're crazy. You're stupid. You misunderstood something. You saw something and you're just, you believe in this because you're dumb. And it's like, that's not always the case. Yes, there are plenty of people out there, and I make this joke all the time that they'll see dust orbs in a photo and it's like, oh, there, look at the 27 ghosts I captured on film. And yes, there are people out there who just want to believe in the paranormal, but so many people I've spoken to who've had experiences, who've either seen a UFO or a ghost or Bigfoot, they didn't want to see it. They didn't believe in it beforehand. They still don't quite believe in it. They'll tell you, I saw something, Jay, I don't know what it was, but this is what it did. And this is what I saw. And this is what I experienced. And they're not trying to convince themselves they saw a ghost. There's people out there who would like a rational explanation for what they saw in the sky or in the woods or in the corner of their bedroom. And if we could give that to them, a scientific explanation, say, oh, no, this is what you saw. This is an earth light, and it happens when there's a minor earthquake and it sends up a little bolt of plasma into the sky, and that's what you thought was a UFO. Great. There's nobody coming to come blow up, skyscrapers in Manhattan. It was just, now I know what it is, I can sleep better. Most people are of that leaning,
Right. Yeah.
So for science and scientists and psychologists to come in and just say, oh, anything you saw, you were mistaken. That to me is so close-minded, so narrow-minded, because even if there's no such thing as Bigfoot, let's just say there's no such thing as Bigfoot. It does not exist. There's no flesh and blood creature. There's nothing coming through portals. What are people like? Just the phenomenon that's itself of the psychological phenomena that people are seeing this thing, that in itself is interesting to me. Demonic possession. What in the DSM 4 or 5, whatever they're up to now. I mean, I'm dating myself here, 5 or 6 now, but
yeah.
What is the diagnosis for that? Yeah,
Right.
it sounds like paranoia. It sounds like schizophrenia, but it's not any of those things. And we don't have a name for it yet. So, but people will just say, oh, they're just mentally ill. And let's forget about it because, yeah, like you said, it touches on the paranormal. It touches on an uncomfortable nerve that people don't want to discuss because of their career, because of their reputation. And instead of legitimately exploring it and saying, what is demonic possession? You don't have to admit that it's actually demonic to study it. You can say, let's take a look at this. And maybe there's a new mental illness that really does only last 3 months. And, it hits you when you're 17 and it lasts 3 or 4 months and you get this exorcism and then you're fine the rest of your life. And that doesn't mean it was a demon. I'm not saying it rules out a demon, but why not investigate that?
Yeah, I agree. And, I think we should. I think we really should. I think we do more damage to a person, ultimately. My pastor has said certain things that he said that one person, the mother called him over and said, my son, he's demon possessed. It was this little kid. I don't know, maybe he was like 5 or 6 years old. And this kid was just acting crazy. And my pastor was able to discern that it was just him acting out. It wasn't, through observing him, through talking with him, it wasn't something demonic. And he would have done more harm than good trying to, he might have even put ideas and thoughts into the kid's mind where, oh yeah, demonic, that's it. And now he's, let me go out and learn some Latin, or let me go out and let me watch a couple movies, and what can I do to make myself look and see more demonic, but more demon possessed. And, and then now this becomes a thing, and that becomes his mental health thing. He's going on, later on in life, just trying to convince everybody he's demon possessed. So yeah, I mean, we do have to approach this carefully. We have to, I think, in my personal opinion, we don't want to just assume there's demons, but we do want to do our best to try to discern what's going on. And from a Christian perspective, we have the scriptures, we have science we can use, and we also believe that there's this that the Lord speaks to us through our thoughts, through our minds, kind of gives us it's kind of speaks to our hearts on certain things and kind of gives us understanding on certain things, and we're open to that as well. Of course, you're not going to find that that's never be supported by science. But another thing about science too is, what if there are demons? If this is true, let's go with the assumption that it's true. We could even go, aliens, that they could phase in and out of different dimensions, or go into some kind of spiritual state. Like, how would you describe that scientifically? I don't think you can. I don't think you could attempt to, but it's not necessarily. Science is pretty limited. The scientific method is pretty limited. Making hypothesis, testing it, having repeatable experiments, having hypothetical models that you can kind of base some already established kind of scientific facts that we kind of use to kind of support these models of the universe or whatever that we're trying to show someone. But I think at the end of the day, the scientific method is extremely limiting. And it's good, don't get me wrong. It's probably one of the closest things we can use to really just determine if something is, I don't even want to say true, because I had a discussion, about a 2.5-hour discussion the other day with my friend Dustin, and he might be watching this podcast, so I'm going to make fun of him. No, but he comes from the position that science doesn't even make the claim that something's true, that science is always open to that thing that you think is true, to later on being discovered that it was not true. That's a good point, because a lot of people believe certain thing, the heliocentric view, and different things, the flat earth, that kind of thing, that different people had these ideas, and they were rational to believe them, and they had some kind of scientific approach to them. But later on, it was found out to not be true, and so there was always room to expand on that. And I think that we should be humble enough and open enough to say, I know something, I'm rational to believe something, I could be wrong. And
that's why when people say like the science is settled, that always bothers me, because the whole philosophy behind science is that it evolves, that it changes, that we learn new things. And it's, I tell this to my son all the time. I say, you go 100 years ago and someone says, oh, we're going to go faster than the speed of sound. And people are going to be like, it's impossible. You can't go faster than the speed of sound. Like, it's just a physical impossibility. From what we knew about the laws of physics back then, a physical object could not go faster than the speed of sound. It was just impossible. It was just, that would break the laws of physics as we knew them 100 years ago.
Right.
Now it happens daily. Now you have,
you're right. Yeah.
We know meteors come into the earth. They're breaking the speed of sound. We have craft that we have built that go many times the speed of sound. I mean, supersonic. I mean, we have military craft that can go 2 or 3 times the speed of sound. If you want to believe certain people, we can go possibly 8 times the speed of sound. So the science is settled today for now, but it's not settled. It's because what are we going to learn tomorrow? What are we going to learn in 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? So it is dangerous to just sort of say, no, this is what we know, and it can't be anything over here because this is the limit. This is
right.
And I think you've said this before. Science is a tool, but science isn't fact. Science is a good tool to sort of say, here's what we know.
Right.
About the world, about the universe, about physics, about whatever. But that can change, and that will have to adapt as we learn things. And they have the Hadron Collider now, and they're sending particles back in time or forwards in time, and it's like, it's a split second, or it's a minuscule little thing, but the implications are huge. That we didn't think this was possible, and now we're sending a tiny little particle back in time. Right. Where is that going to take us in 100 years, 1,000 years?
For sure.
a million years, and
Yeah.
again, you talk about alien civilizations, you talk about, people will tell you there is no God. How do you know? How do you prove a
Right.
negative? How do you prove that something doesn't exist? How do you prove
Right.
there is no God? You can believe, being an atheist is just as much a religion as being a Catholic or being a Jew or being a
Right.
Muslim.
Mhm.
It's what you believe, because we don't
Right.
know. I mean, I don't know that there's a God. I don't know there isn't a God.
Mhm.
So it's a belief,
Yeah.
because scientifically we cannot prove it yet. You
Right.
can
Yeah.
scientifically prove if you drop a ball, it's going to fall to the ground every single time. You could do it 1,000
Mhm.
times, a million times. Gravity exists on Earth. We know that.
Right.
There's certain things we can prove, but does gravity exist on every planet? We don't know. We haven't been
Right.
to every
Yeah.
planet. So until you can go to every single planet, you can't make that blanket statement. You can say, from what we understand and from what we
Yeah.
believe,
Right.
a planet that spins on an axis will create its own gravity. But we don't know
Right.
that. We
And
don't
you
know it.
notice sometimes the laws of physics get bent in different conditions, outer space, and time actually, light gets actually, if I remember correctly from my astronomy class, light coming around a light source coming over the crest of a planet or a star, it actually acts differently.
Right.
It kind of, and it's kind of like the idea of down here, it may be, it's kind of like Back to the Future, where Einstein goes back in time, he comes back, it's exactly 5 minutes or whatever, from when he went out, because when they synchronize their watches, well, they synchronize their watches of the astronauts, when they go into low Earth orbit. And when they're orbiting, the Earth or outside of the Earth's atmosphere, time is actually a little bit different. It's
Right.
actually a little bit, I believe it's a little bit slower. Um, but I mean, it's interesting how what we're so bound to here on Earth doesn't necessarily behave the same once you leave a geographic location in the universe. So yeah, science isn't settled at all. And a lot of the times, like a lot of people say, especially to me as a man of faith, they'll say, "Oh, you're just making a God of the gap argument." And basically, the God of the gaps argument is basically when you don't know something, God.
Right.
So there's a gap in knowledge, you put God. And as the scientific body of knowledge comes and it proves that, okay, Thor doesn't send lightning, lightning bolts aren't sent by God, it's actually, static electricity in the atmosphere and a rain cloud or whatever it is. But anyway, that the gap of explanation, you can't just say it's God anymore. There's a physical explanation for it. So that closes the gap on that. And then you go to something else. Well, we can't explain this, so therefore God. But we also have to be careful that we can't explain this, so therefore science. Science doesn't necessarily I believe the term is scientism, where believing that science can explain everything, it's sufficient for everything. It is not. And like I said before, it cannot explain the existence of math. It assumes math and it uses math. Imagine trying to do physics without math. But physics can't explain physics, biology, chemistry cannot explain the existence of math, but math is found just interconnected through all of it.
Right.
And it's inescapable. But how do you explain it? There's really no explanation for math. It is this really amazing thing, but science cannot explain it. So there's things in the universe that exist that are just completely outside the realm of science. So anyway, yeah, so there's the God of the gaps argument, but a lot of people will put down the science of the gaps argument. Just well, we don't know what it is. Science will explain it sometime. Well, that's great, or science explains everything, or this is it, and it can not be anything else. And then 10 years later, something happens, and we're like, oh, okay, so now
again,
that narrows.
Yeah, and I think a good microcosm of that is not to get political, and I'm really not getting political here, but the COVID pandemic is a great microcosm for how science evolves, because within 18 months we went from wash your groceries, stay 15 feet apart from people, to you don't have to wash your groceries, you can be 6 feet apart from people, to now we have a vaccine, to now it's I mean, just in that time there was that period of time in the beginning we knew nothing about this virus, and then there were things we thought we knew because the evidence at the time pointed to that, oh, this is from contact. You can get this from touching groceries. If you know, when your mailman comes and brings you a package, spray that package down with Lysol. And then, you know, a month or two later, they're like, no, it doesn't transmit that way.
Right.
But in March, that's what they thought. And then by May, they're like, no, it doesn't spread that way. So it's a great little microcosm of just how science can change according to new information. And just because of what we know, you know, it was funny. I was talking to my son yesterday and you know, we were hiking through the woods and we were just talking about, he was just saying about Bigfoot. He was just, you know, we talk about that a lot. And he was just saying, you know, I hope we discover him. I hope we discover it in our lifetime. I hope we have proof of it. And he said something very sort of poignant, you know, just, it's a shame we don't live longer, you know, because our time on this planet is so short. And what we know now, you know, our grandkids are going to know a completely different world. They're going to have a completely different set of science. I mean, again, the foundations will be there, but the details will be different of science of, you know, again, our grandkids may have a cure for cancer, you know, 75 years from now, and we may never see that. We may go to our graves just figuring that cancer cannot be cured.
Right.
But our grandkids could be 75 years old and be like, I got cancer. Let me go take a cancer pill. So it is kind of a shame that we don't live longer and to see that. But the COVID pandemic was a nice little year and a half to see science in action and to see just how quickly it can change.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, you can apply that to, you know, again, not to get political, but you can apply that to climate change. You can apply that to just about anything to say, well, this is what we know. And I've had discussions with people about this too. And it's like, well, oh, it's the hottest year on record. Well, how long have we been keeping records? Not that long. And in the span of human history, in the span of the Earth's history, you know, we've been keeping records for a fragment of the time. And again, I'm not here to speak one way or the other on it. I absolutely believe people have an impact on the climate.
Sure.
But that's very different than saying we have 12 years until the Earth is just unsavable. We don't know that. You know, how can somebody say, you know, because again, 20 years ago, they're like 20 years from now, the glaciers are going to be melting and New York City is going to be underwater, and it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not trying to get political here. I don't want to say that climate change is not a thing, but to say the science is settled, to say we know everything there is, because then 10 years from now, they're going to say, well, now we know everything. And then 10 years later, they'll say, oh, no, but now we know everything. So to get back to the exorcism stuff, to just sort of discard this and to be dismissive and say, it's just mental illness. I understand that's a good starting point, because science should always be the starting point. Start with the science. And that's how I always operate with, you know, paranormal investigating. You start with the science. How can we explain this? Is there a loose electrical wire in the house? Is there a draft? Is there an open window? Is there, you know, you try to look for rational scientific explanations. And it's only once all that is gone that does your mind open up a little bit, where you say, okay, something happened and we've eliminated every possibility that we can think of.
Right.
So then you open your mind to something less scientific and more paranormal. And so for me, I don't know a lot about exorcisms. I know more about the movie The Exorcist than I do about actual exorcisms. People talk to me about exorcisms a lot, and I just don't know, because it's frankly, and again, I'm not trying to offend anybody, it's just something that doesn't interest me, because I feel like the vast majority of it is mental illness. I feel like it's misdiagnosed. And something you said earlier of you bring in priests and they're starting to talk about God and the devil, and that can just make the matters worse, because now somebody who wasn't thinking that is now going to be like, well, I'm just going to blame the devil. You know, it's the devil's fault. The devil made me.
And, so, you know, to add to that, the God of the gaps argument, we don't want to make it the demons of the gap argument. Like every single thing is a demon, it just, that's not a biblical concept either. Demons aren't mentioned much in the Bible. I think there's maybe once or twice in the Old Testament, but primarily in the New Testament. One of the things that was interesting when you hear the accounts of the demons, and this is kind of something that you can look for. outside of like a, outside of, diagnosing something psychologically. Demons in the Bible, a lot of them had powers, like Legion in the Bible. I mean, he could break chains. Nobody could put a chain on him that he couldn't break. I mean, the guy was like supernaturally Hulk strong, but he was just very morbid and would be in the crypts and in the tombs, hanging out all day long. And he'd scrape himself and cut his skin open with sharp rocks, and he was just just really demonized and extremely powerful. And people just didn't want to touch him. They didn't know what to do with him. If they could have done something for him, they would have, but they tried chaining him, and no chain could hold him. And it wasn't until he encountered the kingdom of God, the authority of God, the authority of Jesus to cast them out, that anything could happen. You look, some demonic manifestations of power in the Bible. There was one person, I think it's in the book of Acts, it was this girl. She was a fortune teller, but she was telling fortunes through a demon spirit. And so, Paul's out there preaching the gospel in, some island or some place, maybe Ephesus. But anyway, he's out there, and the lady is, she's following them around for a few days. And this demon is saying, there was a manifestation of power in the fortune telling part. And she was a slave girl. And so the owner of the slave girl was making money off her because she had some kind of like literal gift. Like people would keep coming back to her and pay them money to get a real fortune told, like their future told. And so this girl had this like some kind of, she had a demon in her for sure, the scriptures say. And then what happens is Paul is preaching out in open air in public. It's not just in a church. He's out there preaching publicly. This girl hears him and starts following the disciples, the apostles, around for a few days. But she's shouting out at the top of her lungs, saying, I'm paraphrasing, but these are men of God, believe them, believe what they say. And it sounds like this message that is good, like you would think, oh yeah, cool, thanks,
Right.
Appreciate the help and support. But it wasn't that. It was basically that it was almost like a mocking kind of way.
Yeah.
And after a while, Paul gets tired of it, and he turns around, he rebukes the demon. It comes out of her, and the woman basically, she loses her powers to tell fortunes. And so the owner, the master, and back in those days, there was slavery, and so basically they the master gets pissed, and he goes off to the officials, and he wants them to, he's like, he took away my livelihood here, So there was that power of being able to tell the future. There was also the story in the book of Acts where they have there was this it was called the 7 sons of Skiva, and basically there's these Jewish people that they're trying to cast out a demon. There's the 7 sons of this Jewish guy named Skiva, right? So he has these 7 sons, and they're trying to do so apparently there must have been some kind of Jewish ritual. So they're trying to cast a demon out of this person, and this person's got supernatural strength. And so they're trying to cast it out, and the demon says to them, Paul I know, Jesus I know, but I don't know you. And so basically the demon's saying, I know Paul, he's walking in the authority of Jesus. I know Jesus, he has power and authority, but I don't know you guys. And it says that the demon beat them all, like basically ripped their clothes off, beat them bloody, and sent them off. Like wow. seven guys. One guy beat 7 guys to a pulp. So there's so the demonic entities have power. A lot of times it's in physical strength. Sometimes it's in some kind of like supernatural strength, like maybe fortune telling, like accurate. I'm not talking about like something you could do that would be a coincidence. No, we're talking accurate. Like, no, Jason, I saw you earlier today buying that sub sandwich, and you opted not to put salt on it. I was there, like that kind of thing, like dead on accurate, like that kind of power. It's recognizable, not just a general statement. It could fit anybody.
Yeah.
But anyway, so and I just mentioned that. I know we got to get going. It's probably bedtime, but I'm just mentioning some things that. And kind of like you were saying, if there's some things that are clearly not natural, this person's levitating off the floor in front of you. This person is literally, a 2-year-old girl takes a 500-pound or 200-pound man throws him across the room, that kind of thing. And I do have a story about that, by the way. Briefly, the guy who trained our team on deliverance, he went to Argentina, and he was working with this little girl, and this little girl that was apparently demonized. And he said that when he went to go shake her hand, he said that she said this tiny little girl that crushed his hand.
Wow.
Literally, when she shook his hand, literally crushed it. He was like, his bones were like, he said it was extremely painful, just the way that the power just. We're talking about a little girl with, how much pounds per pressure can that little girl actually do to put an actual man in pain? And this guy, this pastor, is about as big as I am. So it's you'll see those things, displays of power that they'll do. So those are some things that outside of the statistical manual of psychological disorders, you'll find some things that are just, there's almost no denying. You can try to explain it away somehow psychologically, but what are you going to do when you see something like that? And that's where you'll do anything at that point. But but you want to operate under the authority of Christ at that point.
Yeah, definitely.
Not like the 7 sons of Skiva, or you get beat up.
But yeah, that's what I was kind of talking about earlier. Is just that there are things that are kind of outside the known box, and I think when those things happen, science likes to turn a blind eye to it and just say, no, it's got to be mental illness, or it's just got to be mass hallucination. 30 people saw this UFO. They all just saw the same exact thing and have the same exact testimony, and they don't know each other, but we'll just call it mass hallucination and shove it in this box that is convenient. And again, I'm not saying they saw the UFO. I'm not saying it was a demon, but investigate it, look into this a little bit further, instead of just saying, oh, it's just a paranoid schizophrenic, who's got delusions of grandeur, and let's just problem solved. Because maybe there is something more to it, and not demonic, but maybe there's another mental illness to be discovered. Maybe there's, who knows? So, all right, man. So before we wrap up, let's just do it real quick. What do you believe in demonic possession?
Yes, I do. I believe that people can be demonically possessed. I don't. There's some within the camp of Christianity. There's some people who believe Christians can be possessed. I don't believe Christians can be possessed. Because the belief in Christianity is that when you become a Christian, the Holy Spirit comes and lives in you. So it basically kicks out everything else. However, a person who's a Christian can be oppressed. And, that's another thing, tormented or oppressed. Whereas someone who's not a believer, they can actually be possessed, like an empty vessel. As a Christian, the Holy Spirit comes and lives in him. And the Bible says that he comes and he lives in you and he never leaves you. Whereas, someone who is not a believer and gets possessed, they're like an empty vessel. And it actually talks about too, if a demon is cast out of a person and they don't, if a demon is cast out of a person, that person doesn't give their lives to Christ and the Holy Spirit come and live with them. The Bible says that the spirit goes out into arid places, into the spiritual realm, and it finds 7 more demons worse than itself.
Wow. And
it comes back and they infest that person, so that the beginning state of that person, or the end state of that person, is worse than the beginning. So if the first demon was bad enough, there's 7 more that are worse than that one. So now you got at least 8 demons that come into you and infest you, and you're in a worse spot than you were to begin with. So that the idea of deliverance is get delivered, give your life to Christ.
Right.
The Holy Spirit comes and live with you. And if you want to open yourself up to oppression, you want to keep doing bad stuff, you want to go out and do these things, go ahead, but they could attack you. So I do believe in possession. I believe in oppression. I'm not sure what the Catholic view is on that, but that's my view on it, and I can back that up scripturally. But that's the general idea. So
okay, awesome, man. All right, well, this is really cool. I appreciate your, because I went to Catholic high school. I went to CCD during my public school days, so I had religious instruction, but I am not, I'm going to say the saying that people hate to hear, I'm not a religious man. I'm spiritual. I do believe in something. I just don't really subscribe to any particular religion at this point in my life. I'm, may have to rethink that due to some current events that about, but so for me, I approach it more from, the open-minded scientific side of things, or I know, you're like open-minded, man of faith and, spiritual side, and, you go to church and everything. And I don't, because I'm a heathen, and as I drink my beer. But yeah, it's interesting to, I love hearing your point of view on things, because it makes me think.
Yeah, and thank you for allowing me to, I know it's not, religious things aren't that popular, and I understand, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to kind of share my point of view and be open-minded to hear that. We did have the discussion. This is to those who are viewing. We did have the discussion prior to that. I did warn Jason that if we talk about exorcism, it's going to be there's going to be some preachiness to it, and so forgive me if I was a little too preachy. But exorcisms, the very nature of exorcism is a religious act. So, we can't really escape that when we talk about it. It might get under some people's skin, some of the things that we may discuss, or some of the things I might say from a religious perspective, not trying to condemn anybody, anything like that. But, at the end of the day, exorcisms, deliverance, whatever you want to call it, is a religious act, and it originates from religion. So when we get into this type of conversation, you can't separate those things. It's absolutely a religious thing.
Oh, definitely. And I think you have to have, if you're going to talk about the paranormal, if you're going to talk about the supernatural, the unexplained, I think religion has to come into it. I mean, whether you believe in it or not, whether you practice it or not. I have friends who are atheists. I have friends who are agnostics. I have friends who are devout Catholics or Christians or Jews. And all, for me, all opinions are welcome. I don't get the current sort of trend of kind of shitting on religion, and let people believe what they want to believe. As long as they're good people, let them believe what they want to believe. And I appreciate you, because you have this great blend of religion and spirituality, but also science and pragmatism, and that's just I think it's a great way to live. I think being a religious zealot is just as bad as being a scientific zealot, kind of like what you were saying earlier, like the scientism, just religion science becomes your religion at that point, and you're just believing everything that someone on TV is telling you. And then 2 weeks later they tell you something different, and you're like, oh, Dr. Fauci, you're so, and it's like, well, 2 weeks ago he was saying something completely different. You don't have to believe him blindly, and if you do, you're just as bad as someone who's just saying that everything in the world is was created by God, and science doesn't exist. So again, extremism on any side is always a bad thing. So I do appreciate your views. I'm going to let you get going, though, because it's getting late. We're old men. It's getting close to our bedtimes. But this was awesome, dude. I really appreciate you coming on. And you're going to be on again, I'm sure. We'll talk more about it.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. Anytime. This has been fun.
Yeah, definitely, man. All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, have a good night, guys.
You too, man. Take care.
Take care.
Bye. All right, everybody. I want to thank my buddy Josh for coming on again, talking about the Exorcist movie, exorcisms in general, just demonic possession. We're getting into the spooky season, so I figured it was a good time to talk about that stuff. If you haven't seen The Exorcist, go check it out. It's an awesome movie. And got some cool shows coming up in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned. We're going to be talking some Bigfoot. We're going to be talking about haunted locations. And we're going to be talking about missing 411 stuff and people missing in the woods. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think about possession, demonic possession, exorcisms. Do you think it's real? Do you think it's mental illness? Do you think a little bit of a gray area in between? Love to hear your comments. Make sure you give us a like and a subscribe. Really helps the channel. And we'll see you guys next week.